Okay, welcome to
The long-awaited
Witch and a Buddhist Walk into a Bar episode
5?
5.
I'm not confident about that number,
It
but I
is.
think that's
It is
right.
episode
Okay.
5. Cheers.
Cheers. We're drinking
Cheers.
La Vielle Ferme, which has 2 chickens on it.
So we're pretty sure it just means the 2 chickens in
French.
Yeah.
Also not confident about that. And we're here today with our friend Tommie Starchild, who is a fascinating person and is going to have lots of fascinating things to talk to us about. And so, Tommie, I don't even know how to introduce you. You do so much. Would you say I would say that you're would you identify as you're a witch, you're a seer, you're a conjurer?
All those work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't even know how to start this. Let's get into it, I
Okay,
guess.
so let's start by getting to know you.
Okay.
So tell us what you can. Start from the beginning. Give it to us.
Just give it to us.
Just give it to us.
Well, let's start with where did your spiritual journey start?
Well, I was born a coal miner's daughter. Actually, I have a bio written somewhere that does start off that way.
I like that very much.
I like that a lot.
And then there was something. Rumor had it there was a man involved because I was adopted. So I made up this crazy mythos of my beginning. I lost that bio somewhere, but I was adopted, and I was adopted into my family. The pastor of my parents' church arranged for that adoption. We were raised Baptist, and early on I was very into like Old Testament theology, and went to a Baptist private school and would discuss Old Testament theology with adults and stuff. But later on in my my mid-teens, kind of got disillusioned from the Baptist church and left, but still had that interest. There was still something that was calling to me. As a child, I would have prophetic dreams, and I would see things, and spirits would wake me up at night, and all kinds of rather unusual stuff that would happen, and that kind of stuck with me.
So, just sorry to interrupt you, but in the context of the Baptist church you were in, how did they handle you having these kinds of dreams and visions and knowing things before they would happen? And
I didn't tell them.
oh, well, that works.
But I did try to learn reality the way they said.
Yes.
Yeah, it was not going to be conducive to my life to try to explain, because these started at a very young age. So I really didn't even know how to explain them. It was extremely common for me to have reoccurring dreams. I kind of had a set of, I think it was like 4, basically. Mm-hmm. 2 of which I still remember quite clearly.
Can you tell us about one of them, if it's not too personal?
These 2 were kind of co-related because it was the 2 sides of my family, my mom's side and my dad's side, and it also demonstrates kind of how I felt about the 2 sides of the family. I grew up with woods behind our house, and in this particular dream, there would be the line, like a single file line of cousins, and I was at the back of the line, and my grandfather would be at the head of the line, and we're all walking through the woods and this next to this nice flower garden, and everything is pretty and perfect, and we're all walking in single file, following my grandfather. And then I just kind of rise up and fly over everyone and am flying above them and feeling a distance, feeling a separation, a uniqueness, but not necessarily in a comforting kind of way, and kind of an isolated sort of way. And the one with my mom's side of the family, I would start off in my bedroom, and all of my mom's siblings would be over with all their kids. And so I opened my bedroom door, and it was just shoulder to shoulder, like, people back to back, filling the entire house that I couldn't even get out of my bedroom door. And so I fly up over their heads and I'm floating over them. But it was the same sensation of that feeling not noticed, feeling distant, feeling different and unique. And it became apparent to me later on as an adult kind of what that was. But I had one dream. This one wasn't a reoccurring one, but it was one very profound dream. I was still incredibly young, so sex was not something I really knew anything about. But this dream, I was in a hotel, and I was very aware that this was my honeymoon night. It was a big suite, and I don't even think I visually had an experience of what a hotel large honeymoon suite would look like. But my wife was in the bed, far away from like the bathroom door, and waiting for me to come out of the bathroom. The bathroom door is open, and I'm in the bathroom getting ready. Like
How old were you in this when you had this dream?
I was an adult in the dream, but I was probably around second or third grade.
Oh,
wow.
okay.
Yeah, so really young. And getting, like, I know now what the getting ready was. I was probably doing my hair or something. And I look over across this big hotel room and see her sitting in the bed. And then I turn around and there's a man in the bathtub taking a bath. And I remember looking back at her, looking over at him, and kind of looked back. And then I just closed the bathroom door and got in the bath. And then I woke up.
Aha, well that's some foreshadowing, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, too young to really contextualize, but it stuck. Like I could still see the dream just describing it. And so those dreams of flying over and feeling distant from my family also for me became this sort of aha, this identifier that not only being gay, but also being unique spiritually from the majority of my family.
It's really fascinating. So
I haven't told that story publicly.
oh well, I hope you don't mind telling it.
Oh no, that's
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
So you have this kind of feeling of differentness, and then you grew to a certain age. So can you talk to us a little bit about what your church was like what it was like to grow up?
oh Lord.
Like what?
Oh, Lord.
Because you hear Baptist church, and there's all kinds of Baptist church.
Yeah,
So what was yours?
We were technically Northern Baptist, although my parents were Southern folks. My dad was from Tennessee, my mom from Kentucky, so it was a Southern household. But they didn't really have Southern Baptist churches in Michigan, outside of Detroit, where I grew up. And I don't know, growing up, it was kind of a normal church of what I thought a normal church was. I know one of our pastors, one that I kind of remembered for a period of time, left the church to go drive a truck. I thought that was odd, that a man of God would leave being a preacher and go be a truck driver. Otherwise, like, the church seemed very normal, and then some of those kinds of things, we would change pastors, and I didn't really understand why. The pastor that arranged for the adoption, I think he transitioned out to another church fairly early on. I don't really remember him as a pastor, but we did the Sunday morning services and the Sunday evening service and the Wednesday service, and then if there were things for the kids on the weekends, then we did those also. If there was a thing for kids on the weekends that the church was doing, then if we were going to do anything on the weekends, then that was what we had to do. If there was nothing happening, then we could have the option, possibly, to do stuff with friends. But it was all very church related, everything. And I didn't know that was not normal. As far as every single person's experience of what
your life would be very much like involved.
Very involved in the church, being acculturated to view the world through that particular lens. I didn't understand that other people could view the world through a different lens, through different teachings. I thought, this was normal. And of course, Baptist is, the one true religion. And they're the only ones that are going to go to heaven, and everyone else are sinners. And
even other Christians, right?
Only if they're Baptist, then that qualifies. And if they're Catholics, clearly they're not Christian.
Yeah. Catholics are
they're
just
idol
as bad as
worshippers.
atheists,
Yeah,
so.
they're idol worshippers, and they're going to hell. They just don't know it. Bless their heart.
Bless their heart.
So it was very interesting, and as I was still kind of young, maybe not quite a teenager, I do remember taking communion. And they always saved the last pew in the back of the church for our family, because we had a tendency to run late all the time. So they would just save the last pew so we could sneak in and sit down. And so when we take communion, I would have the view of the whole congregation. And I started noticing that the women would take their little tiny, just slightly larger than a thimble of grape juice, because we're Baptist, and drink it. And then I would see the men throw it back like a shot. And I didn't know that that's what... I asked my mom one time, like, what that was. And she's like, well, a lot of the women were in the church before their husbands, and their husbands had alcohol issues, and eventually came to the church to get sober. But here they are with their grape juice, and still with this old habit of doing shots and tossing this grape juice back like it was a shot.
That's funny.
And that said something to me at that age. Like, so... These adults get to live their life and then decide later in life that they want to straighten it up. But as kids, didn't have a choice to live life, that here we were sort of thrown into this, whether we liked it or not. And so it was an unusual observation at a young age.
Was that the one that kind of started to shake you, or what was that moment you talked about where you were disillusioned?
So for anyone that ever hears this, I'm like a screaming queen with dreads and tattoos. So imagine me at a moral majority convention. I didn't look this way then, but still, me at a moral majority convention in the 80s. In Washington, D.C., with Ronald Reagan as the final keynote speaker.
Oh my goodness, I'm having a very difficult time imagining that.
I'm kind of embarrassed now.
Oh, well, don't be embarrassed. Tim told his story, and he was very devout at one point, too.
This was when Reagan was coming out to speak. That was the one time my dad and I never thought about until last few years. He never took my sister, and I don't remember any of the other people from church that went, bringing their wives or taking daughters or anything. I just remember the men. So there's some misogyny for you. So my dad took me. I was actually in between things. I was watching La Cage aux Folles on the television in the hotel, and telling my dad I was watching it to practice my French for school. And I didn't know what the hell they were saying. I was just watching the drag. And so this night, Reagan is coming to speak. My dad wanted to be as close to Reagan as possible, so we sat down on the floor away from our church. And so as Reagan is coming out, there was a protester, which I'm pretty sure was ACT UP. It was in those days, that just stood up and held a sign. And this is way up in the bleacher seats, literally up next to the ceiling. And so he just stood up and held a sign, and all the TV cameras and news cameras swing around to catch this protester. And when they do, what I saw on the news after was the pastor of our church, who I really looked up to. This particular one, I really was inspired by his teachings and really felt that he was a really good man and a really good teacher. and he was beating this guy into the ground.
Oh my God. Wow.
At that point, I think I was probably 16, maybe 17, and well studied in school, well studied in church, and enough to know that this is in stark contrast to everything that he's been teaching, and I just couldn't contextualize a reason for that. There's no explanation for that behavior, and that sort of toppled things for me.
Wow.
And I've learned recently by seeing a live theatrical production of a play called, I think it was This Beautiful City. Extremely triggering about Springfield, Colorado, where the rise of the evangelical movement and Ted Haggard. And it was done. The play is put together by interviews of people from the town.
Wow.
And so it's a playwright activist group that do these interviews, and then they just take the interviews, and basically they're just delivering all the dialogue comes straight from the interviews, and it was very triggering to see with some distance now the indoctrination and the brainwashing techniques and all of these things that were so normal in growing up, and now being able to see from a different perspective, but getting very triggered, and then remembering the story with the pastor and trying to process after, and realizing that I developed a high regard or ethic around spiritual integrity.
That moment for
at
you
that moment,
really
it
sealed
was
that.
it was very pivotal for me, and very very much sealed that in. And it's something I find myself I can get really fired up around seeing spiritual people especially in roles of teachers that don't demonstrate spiritual integrity, because you are responsible for other people, and if you're not living what you're teaching, then what's the point? You know, when life gets rough, that's when we dip into the grace of our spiritual practice, hopefully, and really see the point and purpose of it. It's easy to be witchy when life is easy.
Yeah.
You know, when life depends on it, it becomes challenging to light your candles, when you really have to put it to the test. And so I really, that moment sealed something for me.
That's really powerful. What do you think, Tim? You have anything to add to that?
One thing I was gonna say is, I remember back when I was a kid in church, and one of the big teachings was, you know, you either accept Jesus or you go to hell, and hell was always made a big deal. And I remember one day talking to my pastor. This was not Kendall. This is before I ever moved here.
The famous Kendall.
Yeah, my pastor when I was a kid. I was so confused because I had a lot of family and friends that were Jewish, and I said, well, what about the Jews that don't, you know, accept Jesus as the Messiah? They go to hell? Like, I literally asked this, and I was, I don't know, probably younger than 10 years old, and he flat out said yes. He just said, well, you either accept Jesus or that's your fate. And hell was like drawn in this detailed fire. It was like what you picture hell. That's what they
classic hell.
How they talked about it in church.
Yeah, they had those little booklets.
Yeah.
Those
Tracks.
Those tracks. And
Yeah,
little
we
stories
gave out
and
tracks
things
at the church at my
terrifying.
childhood church.
We get those in our bathroom sometimes.
Not at Kendall's church, but at my childhood church growing up, we had those tracks like, accept Jesus or go to hell, and then like demons and Satan they were so happy if you didn't believe in God, and then
Yeah.
God, and then like there was always this one friend
Who does?
in there who was just like, you must accept Jesus, and the person's like, no, that's all dumb. And I remember reading ones about evolution. It's so funny. Oh my god. Anyway, it's hilarious.
They
in
also-
retrospect.
They also had the
But in
the movies.
in retrospect,
the Rapture movies,
yeah.
where all these vehicles go crashing into each other because the drivers
we love those.
have
Yeah.
vanished.
We freaking love those movies.
We watched
But-
those on purpose.
By age 6, I thought it was 7.
Oh, the Rapture.
But I looked in my old Bible and I have written in there when I became a born again Christian, which cannot be undone. So that's probably my safety net for being a witch. It's like, ha ha ha, you can't undo being a born again Christian.
I think there's this one.
Like that. So you get your ace in the hole.
Right.
Just in
I
case.
Just
guess
in
that is
case.
a Baptist thing. I think
Totally
it's kind
a-
of a Baptist thing.
Yeah, you can't undo that.
Yeah.
So funny.
But isn't there like there's like the unforgivable sin of blasphemy or something that?
Yeah, that's the biggest.
Yeah, but they,
Blaspheming the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't think you've ever done
I've never
that.
done that.
Yeah, we're good.
No,
You're good.
no, I
I
almost
probably
carried
do
the Holy
that
Spirit
daily.
once. That was a little trippy.
Ooh, fascinating.
But by age 6, they had terrified me into becoming born again, and I remember the terror. I remember the pastor of our church interviewing me, interviewing my parents, and he thought that I was way too young to be making such an informed choice. I remember being terrified, and by all means, whatever happened, I had to have that happen. I had to get born again, and then had to be baptized because we're living in the last days. God's coming any minute, and my parents and my sister are going to disappear, and I didn't know how to drive the truck.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so sad.
You see that? Have you seen those bumper stickers that are like, in case of rapture,
Something
car
like
is yours or something? I
Yes.
don't know. Like,
Yeah, I think I have seen those. So you had this aha moment, and then I assume you stepped away from Christianity, or at least the church.
Yeah, because that was followed with my sister getting pregnant, which is a whole other. That's her story to tell, but it was stupid. She wanted to prove to my parents that they couldn't tell her what to do, so she got pregnant.
So she chained herself down.
So she got pregnant, and then she at least knew that she wasn't going to take a bad situation and make it worse by marrying the father, because she knew she didn't love the father for that. But she was
That wasn't the point.
no, she was just being rebellious. And so the church they turned their back on our family because she was pregnant and not going to marry the father. Although there was another teenager about the same age as my sister who had run away from home and had gotten very strung out on drugs, had gotten pregnant. Their family had her get an abortion. They got her on lithium, and they paraded her in front of the church. And it was the first time I'd ever seen the lithium shuffle. As she shuffled in front of the church, and the pastor telling the congregation not to judge her family and everything, and that she's come back to God, and making everything right. My sister chose to keep the baby because she was also adopted, so she wanted to keep the baby, but she wasn't going to marry the father and make it all worse, and so they turned their back on our family. But this other situation, at the same exact time, they treated their family very, very different. And so the inconsistencies, and I was old enough to go like, clearly there's no integrity here. And so our whole family stepped away, which was very unusual. And that was shortly after that I graduated from high school in '86 and moved to Phoenix immediately after turning 18. And still considered myself to be a Christian. I just didn't know where my spiritual life was going to go. I knew I wasn't going to join another church because I wasn't going to sit under the teachings of another person and be misguided again. I really felt that I had gotten misguided. and that my relationship with God was important and valid, and I just didn't know where I was going to go to further that.
So, what? So that you where you started out and where you are now is an enormous difference. So, what was the next step from going from being sort of still Christian but not really practicing any, like not like being exactly a practicing Christian, and leading you to, I believe, the craft was your first step into a different spirituality. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. The church always warned that, you're going to end up in a cult. Not to me directly, but, that's the
In general,
threat
yeah.
to everyone.
They're obsessed with cults.
Yeah, it was the satanic,
Yeah, ironic, right?
the satanic panic of the 80s. And so you're going to end up in a cult. And so there were periods of time.
Actually, I'm gonna be leaving a cult. Thank you.
There was a period of time where I'm like, they're right. I ended up in a cult. But my first boyfriend was the first person to ever refer to me as a white witch. And I thought it was some sort of D&D thing. But he was recognizing odd things happening. He would see them more often than I would. But I think part of that was because it had become kind of my norm.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't really noticing, and it was not his norm. And so he was really taking note of that. And we broke up, and I was like 18, 19 at that time. And so by the time I was in my early 20s, I got up enough nerve to try to study or get books on witchcraft. And I asked my partner at the time, or I said that I kind of think I want to do this. And he's like, I don't believe in any of that hocus pocus bullshit. So, you do whatever you want. I just don't want to see it.
So quickly to ask, because this is something that I think people might be interested. I mean, everybody's story is going to be different. But, like, what was it about witchcraft that kind of called to you, do you think? Like, what did you feel when you heard being called, like, a white witch? What about that opened up that mystery, that curiosity for you?
Well, that story goes back even further, and I only recently remembered this part. So Orion Foxwood had talked about the first time a witch, someone that was born with the blood, comes in contact with their first witch, and it wakes that blood up. And something happens. And that person often doesn't become your first teacher. If they do, it often doesn't last. It usually ends kind of not so great. But they're there to wake something up. And I was like, oh, that, wasn't really my story. And then I remembered I think it was 85, I think, the public school, because I did my junior and senior year in the public school, and they had invited for Halloween a woman to come and speak as a historian who was a self-identified witch, and her name was Gundella. Gundella the Green Witch.
I like that.
of Michigan. And I'd forgotten all about her. And then when I read that with Dominic, suddenly I was like, wait a minute. I remember we had to get notes signed by our parents to go see her. There were protesters, so you can Google it. That's how I found her name. It was a big deal, the protesters and all this stuff.
Right.
And I didn't get my parents to sign the note because there was no way that was going to happen. I defied my best friend. Somehow I made it in to her talk. I don't know how. I was compelled to see her.
Which is fascinating.
I needed to see her.
You weren't afraid to. You just knew you needed.
I knew I
hear from
needed
her.
to see her, and I was fascinated, and I wanted to get near her, and I don't even remember what she was there to talk really American history. So it was nothing really having anything to do with witchcraft. But of course, people were asking questions about some of the stuff that she was wearing, because she wore a big, long black dress and had this big giant pendant of a spider. And she's like, I just like spiders. that was her answer on that. But I wanted to get near. There was something that compelled me to defy everybody I knew and get there. And then I thought that was kind of the end of it. But when I got my first book, again, there was some sort of draw to something magical and natural. So the first book was Scott Cunningham's Earth, Air, Fire, and Water. So I didn't even do like a Wicca 101 book first, because I thought, well, I don't know if that's what I want, but I wanted something about that.
Something about like the nature.
The nature and connecting with nature and elements, and it's something that just spoke to me. I didn't, I couldn't say that I knew what the spell work or elemental work was, but I was drawn, and I was drawn to him in particular, and somehow could hear a familiar voice, and just knew somehow that he was gay, and I could just feel that in his writing. I found out years later that he was, and which was awesome, kind of confirmed. But I could hear it in his voice, and there was something familiar. And I figured if I'm going to venture down this road, I was not going to have a teacher. If I was going to be misguided, I was going to misguide myself. Thank you very much. And
Which we all do.
yeah,
At
so
some point.
I embarked on these books because a coworker is like, just get whatever speaks to you, whatever jumps off the shelf. And so I decided to follow that advice, and it kept leading me back to more of his books. And I would read a little and do a lot, and read a little and do a lot, and it was very experiential, because I was working with a whole different information set. Like, so here was the information I was getting from the books, but what did that mean in practice? So, calling a quarter, calling an element, I'd go out in my backyard and say it all in my head because there was nobody else there with me, so I didn't need to speak out loud. And if the elements are big enough they could hear my head, and so I would do a call and stand there and wait until I felt something, and I wouldn't go on to the next one until I felt something. But then I would go back and do it again and see if I felt the same thing. And then I would do the next one. Yeah.
For like just being solo, know.
And I was kind of building up what I would later, would call now like body memory, was building up a new relationship and taking in the information and then testing that information to see if I get it again, and keep trying to work with that. And this was before I had begun to really acknowledge the fairy companions that I was born with, that I had always kind of known were there. I had never really said anything about them. I kind of knew that they knew that I knew that they were there, but just kind of thought it was a bit freaky.
Now, before we continue, because that's a pretty big bombshell for people who are listening to this who don't know anything about anything.
Right, I was going to have to loop back on that one.
Fairy companions. So when you say fairy, when most people in America hear the word fairy, they're thinking about these little happy people dressed in buttercups that are dancing around in like a mushroom field with little wings. And traditionally and historically, the word fairy did not mean that back in the old country, I guess, the old country.
Right.
It meant a variety of things. So how would you personally define what a fairy is
I think
when
more
I hear fairy companion.
I think more importantly is how would I describe Sims, my fairy companions. I think and early on I would ask them like, so are you this? And they would say yes. I'm like, well, are you this? And they'd say yes. I got to aliens. I'm like, are you aliens? They would say yes. And so I finally realized that they didn't care what I thought they were. But they've always presented as four. Usually 2 males and 2 females. 2 in front and 2 behind them. But they're basically from their torsos down would just sort of join in kind of light.
Oh, fascinating.
And so they were very much kind of light beings that rose up out of this light in some sort of visible sort of humanoid kind of shape. Usually one would talk at a single time. On occasion 2 would talk at the same time, which was very challenging to listen to, and I'm trying to get one speaking, but they're a group that function as a single, yet they're also a hosting. So behind the four are hundreds, a hosting of beings, and so they're sort of the meeting place, for lack of a better term, for the hosting of beings and beings of light or shining ones, as I like to refer to it, made of plasmic light. So huge. They once told me, to give a perspective of how long they've been around, they said they were here at the time in which the earth was molten, and they helped soothe the mother to calm her anger, to calm her rage, so that she could cool and bring forth life.
Wow.
So when we're talking fairies or fae or whatever, big, powerful, spiritual beings, not teacup dancers.
Right, right. And I think it would be hard to find anything written on this time in Earth's history, but the time in which the Earth, before the Earth had cooled, when it was molten, was a time when these plasmic beings, these fairy beings, ruled and reigned on the Earth. These beings of plasmic light, plasmic energy.
So that's like a huge step from Christianity already.
Big step.
I was going to say, the Bible doesn't
Yeah,
mention
so-
that.
Yeah. And that's my kind of personal gnosis from the visions and information that they've
Right.
passed.
And just for anybody who's listening who's unaware, like, I don't know, there's no way to, like, exactly, like, some people are going to hear this and be like, oh, well, he's just a schizophrenic. And the thing is, whether or not that's true, the biggest question is whether or not it's useful and whether or not
Right.
what they're telling you is helping or is coming true.
Right.
And I think that's, for me anyway, is the big determiner if somebody is hearing a spiritual force versus if somebody is hearing, like, a sock puppet in their own brain. If
Right,
that force
right.
knows things that you couldn't have known, or
Right.
gives you advice that helps you in some way, then that's the important part.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's are the voices telling you to harm yourself or others? Are they denigrating you? Are they tearing you down? Are they destructive towards self? These are more common signs of psychosis. Are the voices telling you pieces of wisdom that you didn't have access to, that open up things in your life, as far as maybe opening up doorways or pathways or things coming to you, such as, sort of your life sort of falling into place. Sometimes your life crumbling, but crumbling for something better and new. And so are they helping, are they leading you in a growth direction
versus a
destructive? So it's more common with the expression of something that's a psychosis, is that they're self-destructive, or they're destructive towards self.
Right. And obviously that was not the case with Sims.
Right, that was not the case with Sims. And when I first started reading these books, I still was very quiet about their presence in my life, and finally started mentioning them. And I just referred to them as my entourage. And there was one night in a bar, it was a piano bar in Phoenix, that had a back door. The front door was off to the side, so the entry pattern was L-shaped, but because you could enter through both doors, there was no actual flow of traffic. And social anxiety is kind of a thing, especially where it's crowded space. I don't like crowded spaces. And this bar was notorious for being crowded. Everyone would just cram into the center, and there was no movement. And it was a small bar. So I hated that bar. I hated going in there, but we would go there often. And so
there's a place like that around here. We hate going, but somehow
you end up there.
I hate it.
And so this particular night, I decided, well, all right, if you're real, I'm going to put you to the test. So I had told my entourage, 2 of you in front of me, 2 of you behind me, and we're going to walk through this bar. And I just enter the back door, and I start walking through the bar, and I'm watching people in front of me part where I know that Sims are standing in front of me.
Interesting.
And I look over my shoulder, and I watch the crowd just naturally reconvene behind me where I know that Sims are standing behind me.
Oh, interesting.
And so my heart starts pounding, and I keep walking, and I'm watching this through the entire bar until I walk out the front door, and I get out the front door. I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my
Because that was
God.
like unheard of. Like they weren't bumping into you. Nothing.
They weren't paying any attention to me. I wasn't saying excuse me, nothing.
Fascinating.
They were just automatically moving. They were aware of something,
Unconsciously.
and weren't even turning toward it, just stepping aside, and then regathering behind me back into their little conversation clutch.
So it was like a spiritual experiment.
Totally a spiritual experiment that freaked the hell out of me. I was gonna say fuck, but I don't know if I can say that
You
on
can
your
say
podcast.
fuck on our show.
I like how you said it. That was the best.
So it freaked the fuck out of me, and
It's
I
like,
don't even
was
think I
gonna
went back
say
in the bar.
This word. Wasn't sure if I could.
So part of the reason that I know you is because we have the same teacher in the craft,
Yes.
a specific lineage or a specific tradition in the craft. So you're working by yourself, you're
Right.
working with your Sims. What led you to want to delve into a tradition, when you were kind of very dead set that you're like that you didn't want to be under a teacher again?
Well, I felt that I had kind of plateaued. So I'd moved from Phoenix to San Diego. I decided I was in an abusive relationship and left that, had to leave the state to stay out of it. Drugs were involved in my life, but I decided, I'm the hell with it. Everybody else has had a time in their life to be irresponsible. I didn't have that as a kid. And I was like, screw it, I'm going to take a year off. And I scheduled my year of irresponsibility. And just kind of let things go down as far as they could go. It was an experiment in being like a lost boy.
Well, and after your rigid upbringing, it was probably a way to be to kind of almost burn those last remnants in a way. Right?
And
Just a prodigal son.
yeah, exactly. And shortly after I had picked up my first book, I had felt I had received a calling to do this. I didn't know what this was, but I knew what it felt like. I knew it was a calling, like the church had always talked about a calling, and I didn't know anyone doing this in my life at the time. And so part of the using was running from that. Part of the using was about trying to distance myself from the voice of Sims. I just can't deal with this. This is too much, and I don't want to go down and commit myself to going down this spiritual path, because I really felt like I was going to go even further out as the crazy person that no one would want to be around. And so I just tried to run from it. And so the last 2 years, which was the first 2 years in San Diego, were kind of my last 2 years of drug use, which led me into recovery, which was magical in the first place, because I got to San Diego, and this whole deja vu that lasted for well over an hour, probably close to 2 hours. And I knew that I was there for a reason. I knew the choice that was given to me to stay. And I remember the entire dialogue, different places we had gone to. And I remember getting on a bus and leaving downtown and going, oh, well, it was fun while it lasted. It was just a pipe dream. I can't really do this. And the vision ended there. So I knew, I don't know how to explain this, but clearly I had this option a year ago was the only way I could contextualize it. I made the wrong choice then, and somehow I'm back to make the choice again.
Which often happens.
And so I was
people's
like,
lives.
I have to say yes. I made the wrong choice before, so there's something here for me. And part of that, I'm convinced, was recovery. I would never have known that I needed to go there, and it provided tools. The 12 steps are amazing tools to have. It's a learned experience to bring about a spiritual awakening. And in early recovery, I met Dominic. He was a friend of a friend. I was still a bit of a hot mess then. He saw something in me that he told me about later, but I was still a bit of a hot mess. But I kept seeing him. He was up in the Bay Area at the time and would come down to San Diego to teach a group there. But it was relatively infrequent. But every time he was in town, I would run into him. And he finally had moved down. And by this point, I'd gotten about 2 years in recovery. And I kept asking for about a year if he would take me on as a student. And he kept saying no. And one day he was shopping at Whole Foods, and I worked grocery there, and he was going to take a bus home, which was going to be a pretty lengthy ride, and I was getting off soon, so I was like, I'll just give you a ride. And so I gave him a ride home, and we chatted for a few hours, and he still said no. But we got to know each other a little bit more. I got to talk to him about the work that I had been doing up to that point. I had already been developing and fostering a relationship with my mother goddess Inanna at that point. And she had come to me back in 92, and this was now 98. And ironically, his initiator, Valerie Voigt, is a big priestess of Inanna in the Temple of Dumuzi.
And for those who don't know, Inanna is a
Sumerian goddess. The Queen of Heaven and Earth is her title.
And as far as I understand, a lot of the images of Mary later in Catholicism were directly borrowed from her.
Right, images of her and Dumuzi. Yeah,
Tim.
yeah. The Madonna and Child were taken from the depictions of Inanna and Dumuzi, and actually, the Virgin Mary is seen as current day downline from the cult of Inanna. It was a very popular cult,
Very interesting.
and it's gone kind of unbroken as it kind of passed through cultures. So he eventually broke down and said yes. I think it was a Samhain in 90. So we started studying. Had my first fairy ritual as a Samhain ritual, which is really intense. That didn't scare me away, so I passed that, I guess. And everybody else that had started with me, because there was a small group of us, they all tapped out very early on, and I stayed with it.
So, for a lot of people here that are listening are not going to, I mean, they know a tiny bit about fairy from what I've said about it, but can you describe a tiny bit of what fairy training is like before because there's a period of time where you're being trained before you're actually initiated, and there's a lot that goes into that. So could you describe what that was kind of like in brief, if possible?
Sure. So it's the Anderson Fairy Tradition, spelled Feri, founded by, noted to be founded by Victor and Cora Anderson. And training for fairy, first, there's only one initiation. So it's a priest path, it's a warrior tradition. And so one initiation initiated into priest. And priest we don't see as gendered, it's title. When you step on the path to study, initiation's never a guarantee. And I would meet with Dominic once a week, and the expectation there was that I met with him once a week for class. My responsibility was to show up for whatever it was that he was teaching, and to show up indefinitely. There was no length of time provided. If I was hung up on how long it was going to take, then I probably wasn't right for the tradition.
Sounds very zen.
Yeah, there's, show up for the master and learn whatever he's going to teach, and they
don't expect any results.
right. And the simplest way to describe the training is it's the teacher has to work with the student to bring up their energetic harmonics, for lack of a better term, up to a resonance in which they could be prepared for receiving initiation without initiation blowing their mind. Early on, they used to just initiate. They would remove someone from society and initiate them, which was kind of like going on an acid trip for a year, as they would then piece them back together.
Like a shamanic death, sort of.
Exactly. And then the group, the coven that was doing the teachings would then piece the person back together, raising them up in the tradition. And we can't do that in modern times, so they decided to task Victor with learning or developing a method to teach people into the path.
So it's sort of backwards, where you go through a lot of like a lot of, what am I trying to say? Sort of like self-reflection, a lot of breaking down of things, a lot of recollecting pieces of yourself you might have rejected. Like there's a lot of inner work that happens.
It's all, I would say it's all inner work. I kind of refer to it as kind of going to your internal crossroads. And if you think of the crossroads are life, death, luck, and love, so all the necessary things for life. Your internal crossroads, though, are all those things sort of teetering between self, the ego self, the authentic self, through the mystic and madness.
I like that.
And finding and being able to navigate the magic standing in the crossroads of that place. And so a lot of work around how to shed the layers of the false self. My sponsor was Zen Buddhist. My sponsor in recovery was Zen Buddhist. So that came into my foundation of Feri quite heavily. So I pulled a lot of that language and used a lot of that to supplement my study and practice of Feri, to contextualize some things. And certainly to contextualize my teaching of it, and be able to communicate it. But a lot of digging through and sorting through how you've been doing life, who's been in the driver's seat, and how to get in right relationship with self, so that yourself in alignment with yourself is working in a co-creative relationship with all that is. And that can be your God self, because Feri is very much a recognition of thou art God, but bringing your God self down upon yourself to be the driver that's driving the vehicle that's you.
Right. So it's not your programming. It's not your parents that are driving. It's not your culture that's driving.
Right.
It's you that's driving.
Right.
What is that you though? That's the big
mystery.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that part of you that no matter what is always going to do what's right for you, which sifts through an awful lot of fear, an awful lot of baggage around making mistakes, and that, given the opportunity, I won't make the right choices. But raising yourself up to know that there is a divine quality of self, that if we get out of our own way, we'll always make the right choices for self, and we'll always do what's the right thing to do. In this case, not really using right in the context of right and wrong, but right as in the context of what's in alignment with self. What's in alignment with self.
Right.
It's a very Taoist perspective almost.
And it goes to show why so many of your cohorts dropped out, because facing yourself, like this is like really dumb, but I know it's not really dumb, but I love The Never Ending Story. It's one of my favorite movies ever. in that scene.
That's really dumb.
Where,
You're dumb.
I know, I'm an idiot. But that scene where Atreyu is going through those tests where he has to get to the Southern Oracle and he has to look in the mirror to face his true self.
It.
Right.
I love it.
And that people just run screaming from that challenge.
Right.
And that is very much, to me, fairy training in a nutshell.
Oh,
Right.
Well, that's Zen training too.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Right.
You have to face yourself in silence.
Which is terrifying
Which
as
is
well.
like,
That's the
oh
true.
God.
That's
Yeah.
the true devil. I think is the ego self.
Oh,
The tempter of Jesus in the desert, tempting him with bread and all these and riches
And, yeah.
blah blah. I believe it was his ego self.
Absolutely.
That's beautiful. I love that.
And so yeah, I think it is to see oneself fully, because with that is a heightened degree of responsibility over your actions and choices.
You can't blame anybody after
Can't
that.
blame anyone. And if I align with an understanding that a part of me will always choose what is in alignment with self, then when I make choices that are out of alignment with self, then I need to look at who made that choice. Where was I? What was motivating me to make that choice? I drive home to my students, know your motive, know your motive, know your motive. If you know your motive and you're honest with yourself of what your motive is, you can do whatever you want. Because with knowing and accepting your motive is assumed responsibility over one's actions.
That's really, and
I
have
see.
no judgment over what your motives
Right,
are.
right,
I'm
right.
saying be aware of your intentions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, if emotions are coming up and I don't feel like feeling right now and I want to act out on with some ice cream or sexually act out or whatever, knowing that, I don't want to feel this right now. You just came up and I ain't got the time for you. And so I'm going to act out so that I don't have to feel. My motive is I don't feel like feeling, but I'm going to have to come back to this later, but I will do
Yeah.
so on my time, not when it just shows up, so that I can come back to it consciously. And by doing it on my time doesn't mean 10 years later. It means I don't feel like feeling it right now, maybe later today or tomorrow. I know that this has come up and I'm going to have to address it. I'm going to have to face it, but I'm going to find my strength first.
Yeah.
Rather than it sneaking in when I'm not quite ready
And annihilating you.
and annihilating me, and then it just tears me apart. And so the esteemable action is to step into it consciously, rather than it just knocks your feet out from under. And I'm like, fine, fuck you. I'm not going to deal with you right now, but ice cream looks really good.
So you trained with Dominic, and that obviously carried you through initiation. So what would you say your life... I know this is a huge question, but...
Huge questions are good.
Huge questions are good. And people might hear initiation and they're just thinking, oh, this is like a secret fraternity and now you're allowed in. But for people who practice mystery traditions of some variety, an initiation is really more than that. So what would you say that initiation changed in you? That's a big question.
Everything. So, but by the time I came up to for initiation, was roughly about 5 years after training, because I was initiated in 2003, and by that point I had met Virgil, who's my partner, and I believed the relationship to be healthy, different than my past relationships, and done a lot of work around that to be able to create a relationship that I believed to be healthy. And I knew that there's it's a common story in fairy initiations that people's lives go to shit either just before or right after initiation. Everything crumbles. So my mom had passed away just before my initiation. We actually had to reschedule because initiation empowers everything, and so that would have included the grief. And so I negotiated that Virgil stays. I believed my relationship to be healthy, so I was like, Virgil stays. But I knew if I was going to stake a claim on something and be immovable on that one thing, that I then needed to be willing to let go of everything. Well, I had done that before my mom had passed. because we were already scheduling the initiation. So I was like, okay, you can take everything else, but Virgil stays. And then my mom died. I didn't think that was on the list of everything.
Wow, yeah, that's intense.
And so that was something that had to be taken a look at. Clearly, I was never going to be initiated while my mom was alive, because that's not what happened. And so that was huge for me to have to address and take ownership of. That was what was needed for me to get that release, actually, to have the space in order for initiation to happen. I no longer had in the back of my head disappointing my mother. That was now released. And everything, I really didn't know who I was. I went to CODA meetings. My true addiction was people and codependency. I didn't know who I was. I was a chameleon, so I was whatever anybody else needed me to be. And so I really found myself. Initiation kind of launched that forward in ways that I never anticipated, changing everything about my life. Dominic, I got him to attend a relationship and empowerment retreat that I had written the curriculum for in my previous job, and was doing a lot of the workshops and things. And he sat in the front while I was giving a workshop, and he just was crying. And he told me afterwards, he's like, "I'm so proud of you. The person that I knew that came into my home to study fairy, compared to the person that was standing up there and presenting, is like night and day."
Wow.
Like, I was afraid of my own shadow when I first started with him.
I'm still afraid of my shadow.
Shadows are
Oh
scary.
God, my shadow! It's on you.
That means that there's going to be 3 more months of winter.
Exactly. Damn it.
Anyway.
So yeah, like really, I spent time getting a bachelor's degree in human services with special emphasis on counseling, and now I work as a spiritual counselor and professional witch, or I never know what to call it.
I'm a professional witch.
And I never
Tim.
intended. Like I didn't know that I would be teaching. I didn't know that I would be in Brookings doing a podcast.
I know.
Because I was here doing a workshop. Like, I mean, who knew what was going to happen with my life and the people that would be in my life? And so when I received that calling back in like 92, sitting on the edge of my bed, in a very abusive relationship, and part of studying magic, after I started learning a few things, I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to clean up this relationship by doing magic on the things that are influencing, the issues. And what I learned was how to empower myself.
That's awesome.
And how to empower myself to leave it.
And that's the biggest trick, isn't it?
And so when I received that calling to do this, I couldn't imagine that people like all y'all exist. And that I could talk about this in a way where people were interested and not looking at me like I'm some sort of freak.
You're still a freak.
Well, thank you.
You're definitely a freak.
As are we, obviously.
As are the rest of us. Yeah.
But I thought that I would be very, very alone and very isolated. That it would just be that society would reject me. I've found healthy, loving relationships. I found a healthy, loving relationship with self, a relationship to compassion in ways that I never thought imaginable, a relationship with Jesus as a spirit that I can access and see the way the church always said, but that mechanism didn't open that doorway for me.
That's for
but
another
this did.
episode.
Yeah.
We'll talk about
Yeah, if you want to be on again, we would love to delve a little bit fuller
deeper
into some of that.
Yeah. I do too. I agree too. I mean, I'm actually super into Jesus. I have this book. It's called The Gospel According to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, it's all the sayings of Jesus, or every saying that's attributed to Jesus.
Right. All the stuff in red.
Right. Not just in the Bible, but in the Gnostic Gospels as
Right.
well. Like, I mean, in
that's
the
fascinating
apocryphal
angle.
texts, and then so it's got like the compilation of everything, and it's funny because there's a lot of contradictions in there, but there's a lot of really just like
Good stuff.
seriously golden stuff that I'm like, Buddha couldn't have even said it any better. Like, it's that good.
Well, they've finally come forward with the scrolls that document his presence in India.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they called him in. I remember there was they talk about a person who was in India, and it was the same time that gap in the Bible where Jesus' life is
I've
not
heard a bit
documented.
about that. I don't know much
And
about it. though.
I'm trying to remember the name they gave him. Started with an I.
Isa.
Yes, Esau. Thank you. That was it.
Isa.
Yes.
Yeah, Jesus was never his name. Isa.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeshua ben Joseph or Yeshua ben Maria. And Isa was his.
Esau was his name, and
yeah.
he was like a yogi essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, he went and
Yeah.
studied. He went and studied
Yoga. Yeah.
Buddhism and yoga.
That makes more sense than anything.
Yeah,
There-
he studied Buddhism. He studied Buddhism.
There are said to be scrolls in Tibet. The Dalai Lama has confirmed there are, but he can't go back in because of China. He can't go back in and pull the scrolls out, so everything's locked down. But they have orally stated that no, we have these scrolls documenting his presence in Tibet and
Fascinating.
studying Buddhism.
I'm convinced that this Jesus character went to India and Asia, studied Buddhism.
This Jesus character.
went back to Israel and
Doing it
preached the Buddhist
And, right, was-
message.
blew
and
everybody's minds.
It was totally like turned into something else.
Right, because it was contrary to.
Well, they had to make sense
Roman
of it
rule.
in they had to make sense of it in the context of their own.
Right.
Like, because honestly, approaching Buddhism from a Christian perspective, it's like, it's really hard to make, because it's so polar opposite.
Right.
In Christianity, we're taught to think of our natural selves as evil and sinful.
Right.
In Buddhism, we're taught to think of our natural selves as the only correct way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like really just completely different.
It's very, very compatible with Feri, too.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about the stream of wisdom that runs through all things, and that stream of wisdom is essentially is passing along the same wisdoms, and that wisdoms get contextualized within the cultures that are accessing it, and it'll be garbed in the regalia of the culture. It'll be built in the structures of their architecture, and it will carry the flavors and the stories and the colors and textures of their terrain and their stories and their lifestyles. And so I think it's the same stream of wisdom that flows through all things. We get caught up in the colors, the textures, and the architecture, and miss the wisdom. And I think that was probably the teachings of mystics throughout the history of humanity and still today, is that you can tell a story and the mystery's hidden in the story, and if you get caught up in the details, then you missed it, and well, you weren't meant to hear those anyway.
Yeah.
And then if you link in and listen to what's being passed, then you can get it. It's like the mysteries are whispered on the wind; they're not shouted through a megaphone.
Ooh, I like that.
So, we've probably gone pretty far into our episode.
Right.
And I don't want to have to keep, because we could talk all night, and it'll be
Right.
the longest thing ever.
That was just one bottle of.
I know.
Wine.
I know we're gonna have to like do another one of these.
Yeah, we
So,
are.
just to close, since I know you do much more than just fairy and what we talked about. But this isn't one last big question, I think. If you're okay with that, Tim.
If what?
If you're okay with one last big question.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
So a lot of people hear the word witchcraft, which covers a big umbrella of a lot of different traditions. And there's a lot of people telling us what it is and what it's supposed to be. So what do you think is the most valuable thing that modern witchcraft is bringing into the world? And that's like that's a huge question, but in your opinion, why does this world need it?
Well, to quote Orion Foxwood, when the world needs witches, the witches arrive. And so I think that would be the answer. Do I think that all of modern neo-paganism represents the arrival, each and every one of them? Maybe, maybe not. I view witch as a vocation, not a religion. A vocation that historically involved relationship with other being a spirit being and an animal being. And so it was both the animal kingdom and the unseen world, and often even the plant world as well. And it required these relationships between the worlds, and it was the witch that was ruled by no one, was untamable, that connected to the forces of all of life in the seen and unseen worlds, and was seen as a wild force that could not be tested. And so what do we bring to the world? I think we bring forward that power. Witches are not to be messed with. They bring a power that is not to be tested. Because when you connect to the forces of all that is in the seen and unseen worlds and align with the balance of the natural world, both seen and unseen worlds, the divine flow of energy flowing up from the underworld and flowing down from the stellar world, when you stand and mediate in that space into the physical world, nothing can stand in the face of that power. And the power doesn't come from the witch, it comes through the witch.
So would you say then that it's the calling of a witch to be almost like an intermediary for others and for the world with those powers?
Yes, an intermediary, a bridge of those powers.
Yeah.
Not to have attachment to what those powers do.
And that's a big distinction. That you're not the one making the power, choosing for the power what it's here to do. You're just a conduit in a way.
If an earthquake needs to happen in order to bring balance back to those plates that are in conflict with one another, and if that happens and causes maybe the death of thousands of people, we view that as being very negative. But the earth is finding its place of comfort in those two plates as they were stuck in conflict. And then that conflict, at least for a time being, rights itself and finds a place of comfort for a while. And I think that illustrates kind of the responsibility in the hand of the witch, is to not function...
Balanced as all things should be.
Right, not function within the ethics and morals of sort of the human kind of view of things. I mean, the predator must eat the prey. That's not a bad thing. It's
That's
perspective.
That's another Buddhist thing too. It's like we look at the lion hunting the gazelle, and our heart goes out to the gazelle. But while we're in pain for the gazelle, we're forgetting that the lion has to do this to survive.
Exactly.
And we forget the lion.
Right. And
so there is a balance to
nature.
be
yeah,
had.
and so the witch has to mediate that energy, and to do so without attachment to how that needs to then play out in order for the natural state of healing, the way the natural world heals, is the restoration of balance.
And I think our natural world has been out of balance, been put out of balance
tremendously
for
out
a
of
very
balance.
long time.
And it must be cleansed with fire.
Which fire too?
So light your candles.
Well, thank you, Tommie. That was a beautiful, as always, eloquent and well stated. And I think I'm satisfied. What do you want to say, Tim?
No, I think that was all great. I think this has been an amazing episode, and we'd love to have you back again. We are going to have to end it because it's already been an hour and 15 minutes. So we do have to end the episode, but wow.
To be continued.
Yeah.
I'll have to come back.
Yes, anytime. You're welcome anytime.
That was great. We were so glad that you were on. We loved it. It was amazing.
We still don't
and
have a
then-
closing.
I know. My
never
glass.
happened.
Our glasses are empty. Here's what we're gonna do.
We're going to go cheer. Okay.
Well, we gotta have something in
Oh, God.
our. Oh my god.
Oh,
That was intense. What is that?
our friend just opened a bottle that almost killed everybody.
Yeah. Is that mean?
What is this?
Both of them bolted. I had Eloise right here and Dylan right here.
This
Everybody's
is like a
very
special-
alarmed.
What is this?
What is
We're
this?
drinking?
Magical mead.
Oh, we're
This is mead?
drinking magical mead.
Very
Elderflower
explosive.
mead.
Explosive
We're
mead.
gonna cheers this.
Cheers.
Prost.
That's pretty
Oh, that's
damn
yummy.
good.
It's magical, all right. Oh, I love it.
Until next time,
Until next time.
thank you. And good night.
Namaste.